Hi everyone. Today I just want to go through a little bit of an introduction on cell structure and function. So cells, they're one of the most basic building blocks of life, and for good reason. There are four main features of cells that I'd like to go through today. Firstly, cells can be either prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Now what does this mean? Prokaryotic cells are essentially cells that do not have a nucleus. As the name suggests, pro means before, and kary means nucleus. So these cells are essentially what cells would have looked like if a nucleus didn't exist. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, eu meaning true, have a true nucleus. And therefore, they are able to store this genetic information that they have inside this nucleus, as opposed to having it in a globular shape DNA conglomeration. Secondly, a major function of cells, and a structural aspect for that matter, is that they are small membrane-defined units. Now, what does this mean? Well, cells, as we all know, are small, as they are essentially the building blocks for life, but membrane-bound means that they are enclosed in some sort of membrane. And, if you already know, this membrane is called a plasma membrane. This is essentially a double-layered protective layer on the cell that contains many phospholipids, and that's why it is sometimes referred to as the lipid bilayer. These phospholipids allow for many functions to occur, including fluidity in the cell's boundary, allow for somewhat the movement of the cell, and allow for the cell to interact with the external environment, whether it be swapping different chemicals and solutes with the external environment, or simply just interacting with other cells. Thirdly, a major function of a cell is having a concentrated aqueous solution of chemicals. Now, this concentrated aqueous solution of chemicals is what we also call the cytosol. The cytosol is a liquid that is mainly water-based that exists within a cell that contains all of the organelles, inclusions, and other molecules within a cell. Lastly, cells are also defined as being the fundamental unit of life, and this is something that I have stressed a lot throughout this video. They're essentially what allow for future generations to exist, the actual organism that they are present in to exist, whether by working individually or together, and also allow for many other processes including growth, repair, and reproduction. These cells are therefore containing the basic genetic material for daily function and reproduction. And this leads on to the four main functions of a cell that I'd like to talk about. Firstly, as mentioned in the last feature of a cell, cells are very, very important in order to produce energy. This is because their production of energy is quite in tune with their fundamental unit of life feature. They contain many organelles, including mitochondria, that are able to act as the main energy generation stations for the cell and therefore also for the body. Cells also allow for the exchange of materials with the external environment. And this is very important as well, as cells, in order to survive, require certain molecules and require for waste to also be taken out of the cell in order for it to survive. Next, cells are also quite important as they are able to maintain boundaries. And this is mainly due to the phospholipid bilayer. The phospholipid bilayer, with its highly fluid structure, is able to allow for the cell to move, whilst also for it to have protection. Cells, finally, also allow for the synthesis of biological molecules and can grow and divide. The synthesis of molecules is not only important for the cell, but for the body as a whole. For example, cells can also allow for the production of a protein called hemoglobin, which is essential in the carrying of oxygen around the body. Whilst on the other hand, cells can create various protein molecules that are able to help themselves in their own production and daily life. Division, on the other hand, is very important, as division allows not only for the growth of the cell itself, but the growth of the organism. Another very important theory that I would like to go through in this video are the 4 central tenets of cell theory. The first tenet states that the cells are the basic structural and functional unit of all living organisms. And this is, as we know, true. Them working individually and as a team is able to allow for the organism to survive. Secondly, cells' activities are able to influence the activities of an organism, and therefore the collective and individual activities of the cell allow for the presence of the organism. So as I've mentioned many times during this video, cells are able to allow for the individual to live, whether they be adipose cells, erythrocytes, or even neurons. These cells are able to either work together or separately in order to reach a common goal, and that is the survival of the organism. Thirdly, we have the principle of complementarity. This principle states that essentially the biochemical activities of a cell relate to the subcellular structures that are present. In simple terms, this means that the structure of the cell is related to its function. So, for example, if we were to take an adipose cell, for example, this cell is quite large and has a nucleus that's pushed off to one side. In this case, structure relates to function, as the cell needs to hold as many nutrients as possible, and therefore compensates for this. On the other hand, neurons are quite long, as these cells are essential in the communication between many different parts of the body, and therefore their structure reflects their function. Finally, the last central tenet of cell theory is that the basis of life has and is dependent on cells. So generations, from mother to daughter to granddaughter, is all dependent on the activities of a cell.